Here's an example of a sine graph that has a phase shift and requires factoring. We have y equals 3 sine 2x minus pi over 2 minus 1. First things first, let's factor out our b values. So we have y equals 3 sine. If I factor out the 2, then in the bracket I'm going to have x minus pi over 4. That way when I multiply it back by the 2, we would have the pi over 2 that used to be there, minus 1. Minus 1. Any second now, the whiteboard will catch up. There we go. So now that we've got it in this form, we want to set up our x and y axis. You'll notice I spread this one out a lot. Because we have that pi over 4, I'm making my pi every 4 lines. That way one line is pi over 4. It's easier to graph. Okay, similarly, we have a 3 in front and we have a minus 1, so I know we're definitely going bigger than just 1 or 2. I'm trying to make my y-axis wide enough that I can fit everything. Once we have that, we can just start pulling information off the graph. So same as last time, we can use our d value to find our midline. In this case, our midline is -1, so that means our graph is going to be centered around the y value of -1. I'm just going to put in a little dashed line there so I have something to work off of. Okay, we have an amplitude of 3 from our a value, which means the graph is going to have a maximum and a minimum that go 3 above and 3 below the midline. So we might as well fill those out right now. Our maximum is going to be the centered -1 plus 3, which is a maximum of 2. Our minimum is going to be, if we go from -1 and we subtract 3, that's -4, our max and min values. We do have a change in period because we have that b value of 2. So to find our period, we can do 2 pi divided by b. In our case, that's 2 pi divided by 2. So we actually just have a period of pi. Okay, which means likely in my graph, I'm going to be able to fit multiple periods. And the last thing we need to consider is the phase shift. So the phase shift comes from this value here, which is why we really need to make sure we factor. So we get the pi over 4 and not pi over 2. Now, because we have a minus pi over 4, we want to go pi over 4 to the right. I can actually just take this into account straight away as I'm graphing, but just so we have it here, let's fill it in. Phase shift, pi over 4. Now, since we're doing a sine graph this time, I know sine normally starts at 0, 0. I would instead like to start at my midline, so I'm going to temporarily put a point there, even though I know that's not where the point is. That's my centered place. Any kind of vertical stretch isn't going to affect that, but what will affect it is the phase shift. So I'm still centered on the midline at -1, but I need to go pi over 4 to the right. So my point is actually going to be here, pi over 4. And that means when I go an entire period of pi, I should end up back at the same spot. So going an entire period of pi is 4 little lines. It's going to be over here. That's going to get me back to the middle. Okay. Halfway between that is also going to be going through. I'll just remind us underneath, the shape of a sine graph is kind of like that. So there are, in one period, there are 3 places where it kind of crosses that midline. And we've got all 3 of them. Now between the first and the second green dot that I have there, we can have our maximum. Because we have an amplitude of 3, we're going to be going up to 2 for our maximum. And then between the second and the third dot going through the midline, we're going to have our minimum, which is going to be -4. Okay, you'll notice my graph looks quite steep. You'll notice my graph looks quite steep, but that's really just down to the scale that I had. If I had spread out pi to be 8 lines instead of 4 lines, then maybe the graph would look a little bit wider. So anyways, we can fit in that minimum point down at -4, and now we have one entire period. And I'm actually going to put that shape in before I start adding more points. There we go. If I want to add more points, I can just follow the same thing. So I know pretty much every one line, every little piece of the graph is pi over 4, and I'm going to go from the midpoint up to the maximum, back through the midline, down to the minimum, back through the midline, up to the maximum, back through the midline, and each time I'm just going over pi over 4, and then I'm either getting back to the midline or I'm going up to a maximum or down to a minimum. You can also do the same thing going to the left, but it's just going to keep following that same pattern as you go. And there we have it.